I feel like I'm reaching that stage in life where I'm crossing something of a Rubicon. Not just numerically, although also that. The threshold I'm experiencing is moving from that phase of life where your kids think you're cool to when they know for a fact that you are not. Because like when you're young and your kids are young, you are like practically a god to them. You meet all of their needs, you structure their entire environment, you can answer almost all their questions and bluff your way through the ones you can't. Like you are amazing in the eyes of your kids. And then your kids get older and you get old and that all changes. I mean, kids will dunk on adults for almost anything. Not necessarily just my kids, but kids in general, tweens, teens. Have you ever experienced this? Like you are a fully grown professional adult. You have multiple degrees, you have a career, you've accomplished serious things in life, and there's some punk kid just like picking you apart for no good reason. And they will pick on you for anything. Like your taste in music that you have carefully cultivated over decades, it is just trash. Or if you use the wrong words, like if you use slang that is either too old or too new, they will just tear you apart. Try it. I mean, next time you're talking with a tween or teen, slip in a word like groovy or riz and watch what happens. It will not be pretty. My wife's a teacher, so I hear that teenagers even make fun of the jeans that adults wear. Like, how can jeans be wrong? They're jeans. Like, by definition, they are fine. But my kids have recently developed a very, very specific way of ridiculing me. One kid in particular. You can ask me later which one it is. They tell me, Dad, you quote N.T. Wright too much in your sermons. Which, what? Like, how is that even an insult? But clearly it is an insult, in their eyes at least. So at the risk of incurring the wrath of my children and ridicule of my children, I want to tell you a story that N.T. Wright tells. If you're not familiar with N.T. Wright, you should be by now if you've been listening to my sermons. He is one of the most prolific and influential New Testament scholars working today. He also goes by the name Tom. He's an Anglican bishop, and he writes prolifically about the history of Scripture and Second Temple Judaism, the cultural era into which Jesus came and in which the New Testament was written. And so he's written extensively about the writings of Paul and how we understand them, and extensively about the historicity of Jesus. Are the stories we have in the Gospels actually historically reliable? And that investigation led him to studying the resurrection. And he has come to the conclusion through all of his research and study that a bodily resurrection of Jesus is the best way to make sense of the available data that we have in the historical record. And so that investigation then led him to writing about, well, what is the significance of that? If the early church's hope was for bodily resurrection, what does that mean for us in our theology today? So he's written extensively, traveled and spoken extensively, and he tells this story that when he was researching all of this, he was also working as a bishop in the Anglican church, and he found himself in London in the backseat of a cab one day. And the cabbie looked in the mirror and saw his purple shirt and his collar, and he said, "Oh, you're a bishop, eh?" And N.T. Wright goes, "Yes." And the cabbie goes, "Which franchise?" He didn't say franchise. That's just my favorite way of talking about denominations. Which denomination are you part of? And Wright goes, "Oh, I'm a bishop in the Anglican Communion." And the cabbie was Catholic, but he knew enough to say, "Oh, the Anglicans. You all are having a terrible time about women bishops right now, aren't you?" And it was true. The Anglican Church was fracturing and tearing itself apart over whether women could be ordained to the level and office of bishop. And they came up with all these complicated, convoluted ways of navigating it. They developed a system of what's called flying bishops, which is an amazing name, 10 out of 10, no notes. And what a flying bishop is it's a bishop who has never, ever consecrated a woman into the priesthood. And so if you are a parish that doesn't recognize the validity of women in ministry and you're ordaining a new priest, you can request one of these bishops to fly in from their district and consecrate your priest. Just utterly wild stuff. They're having a crazy, crazy time, all of these fights. And so Wright's sitting in the back of the cab, and this cabbie goes, "Oh, you're having a terrible time about women bishops." And Wright goes, "Yes, we are." And he was very much involved in those fights and arguments at the time. And the cabbie looked at him and he says, "Well, the way I see it, if God really did raise Jesus from the dead, then everything else is rock and roll, isn't it?" Now, it is reasonable to be a little bit skeptical of prolific writers who end up in the back of cabbies, and their cabbie gives them this incredibly pithy and profound response, whether the person in the back of the cab is Tom Wright or Tom Friedman. It's reasonable to be just a little bit skeptical of that. But there is something remarkably true about this. If God has raised Jesus from the dead, then everything else is rock and roll. Or another way you might say this is that it is an invitation, resurrection is an invitation to rethink all of our priorities. That the things that seem really significant and important and worth fighting about, like whether women can be bishops or not, or whatever other debates or disagreements we have within the church, all of those get relativized by the reality of resurrection. And it's not just church matters. Everything about what it means to be human, the things that we believe to be true or valuable, important, significant, all of that gets reworked if the resurrection is true. If God has raised Jesus from the dead, then everything else is rock and roll. So the question is then, how do we rework our priorities and our values and our intuitive assumptions about the way the world works? How do we align those with this new reality, this new world, this new way of being in the world that has dawned because God has raised Jesus from the dead? And I think fully answering that question is the work of a lifetime. If you continue reading in the Gospel of Luke after the story of the resurrection that Ari and Addie read for us, you come to this story of the walk to Emmaus, where there are two disciples going home having been had all of their hopes and dreams dashed by the crucifixion. And this stranger comes and begins journeying with them. And this stranger begins to unpack and explain what really was going on. And when they get to the end of their journey, they break bread together and their eyes are open and they see this is the risen Christ, this stranger who has been journeying with us. It takes the entire journey for them to get there, and so it is with us. To really understand what it means to rethink all of our priorities in light of the resurrection is the work of a lifetime. But I think we can give two hints, at least directions we might think in, directions we might think toward, things that might change, things that might need to be reevaluated in light of the significance of the resurrection. If God really has raised Jesus from the dead, then what changes? One thing we might point to is that our understandings or intuitions about the importance of power change. If the resurrection is true, and I believe that it is, then power, particularly the sort of power that is enforced by state violence, is perhaps a little bit less important than we have been led to believe. Because think about what crucifixion is. Crucifixion is one of the most terrible powers of state-sponsored violence that existed. I don't know if we could say it's the absolute worst. I think Roman siege warfare was also pretty imposing and impressive and gave you a sense of the might of Rome. But crucifixion was designed to make a public spectacle of its victim. Although we see Jesus in all of our art and iconography wearing a loincloth, it's likely that the New Testament writers recognized that Jesus had been crucified naked. It's how people were crucified. And it was designed to make a public spectacle, public humiliation. As they hung there in agony, it was designed to remind everyone, this is what happens if you go against the empire. The empire has all the power, and if you go along and get along, you will be okay. The empire will use its power on your behalf, and good things will come for you. But if you get out of line or go in the wrong direction, this is what happens. We have this same logic in the death penalty today. People say the death penalty functions as a deterrent to crime. People know that if you commit certain types of crime, the state will end your life. And so that's supposed to deter them from opposing or disagreeing with the state. But if the resurrection is true, if God did raise Jesus from the dead, then this awesome power of the state is not quite so awesome. It's not quite so imposing. It's not quite so powerful. Real and true power, if the resurrection is true, lies somewhere else than in the power of the state to impose violence on human bodies. Now, we are living through a year that is a multiple of 4. And so we are all being told that state power matters an awful lot right now. And as we move between now and November, we are going to be reminded again and again that we are living through the most important election of our lifetimes, again, ad nauseum. And I wonder what it means to practice politics as Christians, to practice politics as followers of Jesus, to practice politics as people who recognize that the resurrection is real. And so state power is not quite as significant as we have been led to believe. Another thing I think we're invited to rethink the importance or significance of is the importance of people, of individuals, of human bodies. And the resurrection reminds us that people are perhaps a little bit more important than we have been led to believe. It is one of the great tragic ironies of Christian tradition and Christian faith that a religion that begins with God taking on flesh and ends with God coming back to life enfleshed in a human body, this religion that begins and ends with those terms has become a religion that often doesn't seem to care all that much about the well-being of individual people and individual bodies. In many ways, Christian faith has become pie in the sky when you die and the sweet by and by. It is not actually about the well-being of human beings right here and right now. But if the resurrection is true, then God cares deeply about the well-being of each and every person. Human bodies in Christian faith matter tremendously. And so we care about things like life not being cut short by acts of terrorism or war. We care about people having enough to eat and to be able to provide for themselves and for their families. These are Christian values, Christian convictions, because the resurrection is true. Amy Jill Levine, who's a New Testament scholar who is not convinced by the sorts of arguments that N.T. Wright puts forward, not convinced of the historicity of the resurrection, even she recognizes this. Well, she's a skeptic about the reality of a bodily resurrection. She makes it quite clear. She says, to insist on a literal resurrection, but to have no concern for bodies, seems to me a strange way of proclaiming Jesus as risen. So to assert and proclaim that the resurrection is true, to affirm that God has raised Jesus from the dead, to build our faith on the truth that Jesus is risen indeed, is to assert a faith that says human bodies and the way we treat them and the way we care for them and the way we protect them and the way we provide for them, this matters deeply. It is an invitation to rethink all of our priorities. It's a journey of a lifetime, but two places we can start is to recognize that the reality of the resurrection reduces the importance of raw power, particularly the sort of power backed by state violence, and it increases the importance and significance of individual human bodies, because God has raised Jesus from the dead. And so we can be people who go from here amazed at what has happened. Thanks be to God.